60 years of silence. Millions endured injustice. Then one young black president stood up and shook a glittering world summit with just 3 sentences. The chandeliers froze mid-sparkle, cameras stopped blinking, and for the first time in his career, Trump had no words. What could be powerful enough to steal the breath of presidents, billionaires, and generals alike? Tonight, you'll feel every heartbeat of that moment, the whispered insults that built for decades, the quiet fury of nations called ungrateful, and the thunderous hush that followed a single steady voice reclaiming dignity for a continent. This story is a cinematic reimagining, names, places, and emotions drawn from the headlines, woven into a dramatic narrative to illuminate truths. Facts alone can't carry. Let it remind us that fiction can echo realities too raw to ignore, that empathy often begins where pure reportage ends. Ready? Take a breath, lean in, and witness the 3 sentences that made the world finally listen. Geneva, Switzerland, October 9:27 a.m. The marble floors of the Geneva International Conference Center didn't echo like most marble floors. They absorbed sound, as if history itself had demanded that power walk quietly here. Beneath their polished surface, 1,000 whispered deals had been struck, promises bartered, destinies rewritten, and all under the illusion of civility. That morning they were polished to mirrored perfection, ready to reflect the shiny shoes of presidents, bankers, and tech gods. The air inside the building didn't just hum, it hummed with hierarchy. Outside, autumn winds curled around the sleek steel and glass exterior. Inside, everything was temperature-controlled, surgically lit, the scent of expensive cologne mixed with freshly pressed paper and imported coffee beans. Today wasn't just another conference. It was the Global Development Forum, an annual gathering of the world's decision-makers, power brokers, and money guardians. But this year, there was a whisper moving faster than the wind outside, a whisper with a name. Traoré. Before we get to him, let's look around the room. Rows of crystal chandeliers dangled above, like interrogators' lights in a palace, casting refracted rainbows onto the floor. Every light bulb inside had been tested 3 times. Every flag behind the stage measured to the exact centimeter. No nation taller than another, not by accident. The main hall resembled a theater designed for gods. The seating was U-shaped. Not for inclusion, but for surveillance. You could see everyone. Everyone could see you. Each country's delegation had its own pre-polished water glasses, aligned with military precision. One journalist would later joke, "The ice cubes here have more protocol than some embassies." Uniformed security guards lined the exits. Their uniforms were crisp, not a wrinkle in sight. Their eyes didn't wander. They scanned, rehearsed, not for weapons, but for anything that might break the script. And the script was everything, because here nothing happened by chance. The schedule was locked weeks ago, the lunch menus chosen months in advance. Even the claps were rehearsed in pre-meetings among staffers. When to smile, when to nod, when to frown thoughtfully. The only thing no one could schedule was what Ibrahim Traoré might say, and that's what had people nervous. They didn't seat him near the center. Number he was at the far left end of the U-shaped table, practically against the wall, technically included, but unmistakably marginalized. That kind of seating was a message, and anyone who had ever been to one of these events knew how to read it. Traoré hadn't brought a suit. He wore the same dark green military jacket he always wore, pressed, clean, but unpretentious. The room was filled with silk ties and diamond cufflinks. Yet his quiet presence somehow weighed more than their gold. He arrived with no entourage, no translator, no PR manager to fix his face. Only a small notebook, the kind a soldier might carry in his pocket. Some delegates assumed he would say nothing. Others assumed he wouldn't dare. But some whispered that he was different, that he'd taken power not for glory, but because his country had been choking under foreign contracts, military deals, and smiling partners who always left with more than they brought. And today he was watching. His eyes scanned the room, not with awe, but with calculation. as if he were measuring the architecture of power itself, not to admire it, but to find its cracks. Meanwhile, at the center of it all, like a solar system with him as the sun, sat Donald Trump. Red tie, bright lapel pin, hair combed with almost religious precision. He didn't whisper, he radiated. His team had arrived in two black SUVs, Secret Service posted at every entrance. He didn't carry a notebook. He carried history, loud, messy, unapologetic history. To some in the room, he was a spectacle. To others, a storm in human form. And today he was expected to dominate the discussion on global aid. That's what made the silence so eerie. Because everyone in that room, whether in $1,000 suits or crisp military garb, knew this wasn't going to be one of those say nothing, agree on everything kind of summits. Something was off script. Something was brewing. The chandeliers sparkled. The cameras were already rolling. And one young African president, seated far from the spotlight, was about to say something that would change everything. But first Trump would speak. And when he did, the marble beneath their feet wouldn't just reflect their shoes, it would start to crack. If power had a sound, Donald Trump brought it with him. The moment he entered the Geneva International Conference Center, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Heads turned instinctively. It wasn't protocol, it was gravity. His entrance was timed, calculated, and larger than life, like a curtain rising on a Broadway act in which he was the star, director, and producer. He was flanked by a wall of people, aides, Secret Service agents, press officers, policy advisors, and the ever-present camera crews. Each moved like orbiting moons around a planet that refused to be ignored. His suit was immaculate, cut with sharp lines like decisions made without second thoughts. His red tie, the same hue he wore when announcing his presidency years ago, hung straight down like a statement, bold and unyielding. His expression held that familiar blend of confidence and confrontation. Trump didn't walk into rooms, he took them over. As he stepped toward the central seat of the U-shaped table, some delegates smiled politely. Others avoided eye contact. Even those who disagreed with him still leaned in, compelled. That was the paradox of his presence. A man both dismissed and irresistible. He waved as if campaigning, nodding with the assurance of someone who believed, perhaps truthfully, that no one could ever outshine him in his own spotlight. Trump's arrival was not quiet. And yet, not 30 minutes earlier, another man had entered the same building almost completely unnoticed. No entourage, no flashing lights, not even a media whisper. Just a single figure, moving with purposeful silence through marble halls that weren't built for men like him. Ibrahim Traoré, the 35-year-old president of Burkina Faso, arrived like someone who wasn't there to impress, but to observe. His military uniform, a deep forest green, didn't scream for attention, but it didn't need to. It carried weight, not in its fabric, but in what it represented. No golden lapel pin, no designer watch, no gestures exaggerated for the cameras, just a notepad, a calm expression, and eyes that missed nothing. He moved like someone who'd grown used to navigating between broken promises and colonial shadows. He walked through polished halls once tread by emperors and executives with the steady pace of a man who didn't fear rooms like this, but didn't trust them either. For many in the room, Traoré was still an unknown. Too young, too unconventional, too revolutionary. A man who had seized power through a coup, who spoke of sovereignty instead of reform, of dignity instead of development metrics. Western leaders called him unpredictable, a word they often used when someone stopped asking for permission. But Traoré wasn't unpredictable. He was unreadable. There's a difference. Where Trump radiated power, Traoré contained it. Where Trump used volume, Traoré used stillness. Where Trump arrived to dominate, Traoré came to listen and calculate. They couldn't have been more different, and yet here they were. Two men sitting in the same room, representing two ends of the global order. One, a symbol of dominance built on decades of influence, wealth, and expectation. The other, a question mark carved from struggle, silence, and stubborn independence. Trump's body language was open, expansive. He leaned back in his chair, spread his hands across the table, interrupted conversations before they ended. He thrived on control, attention, reaction. Traoré sat at the very edge of the U table, arms calmly folded, gaze forward. He wasn't bored. He was calculating the room, like a chess player who sees 20 moves ahead but says nothing. People watched Trump to see what he would say next. People glanced at Traoré, wondering if he would say anything at all. And that uncertainty, that pause in expectation, was what made the difference so sharp, so unsettling. Because power wasn't just about speaking the loudest. Sometimes it was about knowing exactly when to speak and making the world wait for it. As the moderator prepared to open the session, adjusting his notes and clearing his throat, the stage was set, not for policy discussion, not for polite nodding and recycled statistics, but for collision. The cameras were ready, the microphones were hot. Two men, two histories, two worlds. Only one would walk away having changed the rules of the room. But no one knew that yet, not even Trump. The lunch break ended, not with a bell, but with a soft wave of motion, like the tide returning to shore. Delegates filtered back into the main hall in tailored suits and subdued voices, their plates emptied but their intentions sharpened. The scent of roasted lamb and espresso lingered faintly in the air, mixing with the metallic chill of anticipation. As they resumed their seats beneath the crystal glare of the chandeliers, the atmosphere had shifted. It wasn't overt. No alarm sounded. No visible conflict. But something beneath the surface had changed. Something unspoken, electric. Even the lighting, though technically unchanged, seemed somehow colder, as if the walls themselves were preparing to witness something they couldn't quite articulate. In the press gallery above, journalists leaned in, some whispering across seats, others checking their recording levels and camera angles. Normally, these panels were routine, harmless speeches, rehearsed platitudes, safe soundbites. But today's combination of personalities had everyone on edge. They murmured names like Code, Trump, Traoré, Macron, Miller. It was the kind of lineup you didn't get twice, the kind where something was bound to go off script. A seasoned BBC correspondent nudged her producer and whispered, "If anything explodes today, it won't be bombs. It'll be words." Down on the floor, the seating arrangement told its own story, one most viewers would never notice, but which every leader in that room understood. Trump sat dead center in the most visible seat, flanked by the G7 inner circle. France, Germany, Canada, Japan, each carefully spaced, each within camera range. It was a setup designed for optics, for narrative control. This was the nucleus of global authority, shining, confident, perfectly calibrated. And at the far end of the U-shaped table, near the exit, practically out of frame, sat Ibrahim Traoré. It wasn't a mistake. It was positioning. You could call it protocol. You could call it coincidence. But for Traoré, whose life had been shaped by the politics of posture, the message was clear. You are here, but not central. Present, but peripheral. Visible, but voiceless. He didn't flinch. He simply observed. One by one, he watched as the other leaders took their places, adjusting microphones, smoothing lapels, murmuring to advisors. He studied them like a man surveying an enemy's fortifications. Not with contempt, but with clarity. Every subtle smirk, every sideways glance, every tightly gripped glass of water. He was taking notes, not on paper, but in silence. He noticed that when Trump sat, he didn't look left. No acknowledgement, no nod, no gesture toward the young African leader seated at the edge of the table. That too was deliberate. Traoré exhaled slowly, steadying himself, not out of fear, but precision. Because if the room thought he was invisible, they wouldn't see him coming. And that, perhaps, was the most dangerous kind of presence. The moderator cleared his throat once more. The microphones clicked on with faint pops. Cameras adjusted their focus. The stage was set, but no one in that gleaming, orderly room knew just how soon the first spark would fly, or how it would leave everything scorched. The room fell into a practiced hush as Klaus Müller, the moderator, leaned into his microphone and delivered the obligatory opening. Distinguished leaders, honored guests, we now turn to the President of the United States, Mr. Donald Trump, to share his perspective on international development, in global responsibility. His voice, calm and measured, carried the weight of 20 years moderating similar panels. He had seen passionate speeches, diplomatic gaffes, even the occasional flare of ego. But something about today felt different, and he wasn't alone in sensing it. Trump adjusted his microphone, then paused for just a breath longer than necessary. Not because he was unsure, but because he understood the rhythm of theater. This was his stage, and he was about to own it. "Thank you, Klaus," Trump began, his voice firm and instantly recognizable, even without visual cues. "Let's just cut the nonsense." The sentence hit the room like a cold gust. Some blinked. Others leaned in. Journalists froze mid-sentence in their notepads. The moderator's eyes flickered with a flash of alarm. Off script already, and it had only been 5 seconds. "I know we're supposed to sit here and say all the right things," Trump continued, now sitting back in his chair, one arm slung over the backrest, with the relaxed dominance of a man who'd done this dance before. "Talk about partnership, mutual respect, sustainable development, shared goals, blah, blah, blah. But let's be honest, shall we?" Now he stood, pushing his chair back with a scraping sound that echoed far too loud for comfort. It was no accident. He wanted attention, and he had it. "Everyone here knows the truth, but no one wants to say it, so I will." His eyes scanned the room, not seeking approval, challenging it. "We, the West, the United States, Europe, Japan, Canada, we've poured more money into Africa than any other place on earth. Schools, roads, hospitals, clean water, power grids, food aid, vaccines. We paid for all of it. You know it. I know it. The world knows it." He paused dramatically, letting the silence stretch just enough to feel uncomfortable. "And what do we get in return?" His voice sharpened now, tinged with indignation. "Criticism, accusations, neocolonialism. Exploitation. That's the thanks we get? Really?" Several leaders shifted in their seats. Macron glanced at his notes but didn't read them. Schultz stared ahead, expression carefully blank. Journalists in the back whispered furiously into their microphones, reporters' pens scratching faster. Trump continued, now pacing lightly behind his chair, hands animated. "I mean, look around. Half of the infrastructure that got these leaders here today, the airports, the highways, the fiber optic cables, the electricity, was funded by Western aid. And now we're the bad guys?" He gave a short, incredulous laugh. "Instead of gratitude, we get lectures. Instead of partnership, we get rebellion. We give billions, and in return, we get told we're the problem." Then came the moment everyone would remember. He stopped mid-pace, turned sharply toward the far end of the table, the end where a solitary man in a dark green uniform sat, still and silent. "Some of these new leaders," Trump said, voice louder now, "they act like they built their countries from scratch, like they climbed out of poverty without a hand from anyone. But we all know that's not true." He didn't say Traoré's name. He didn't have to. "We gave you progress," Trump declared, his finger cutting the air. "On a silver platter. The least you could do is say thank you." The weight of those words fell like stone. There were no gasps, no interruptions, just stillness. The kind of stillness that doesn't happen by accident, but because something had shifted, permanently. Even Trump, for all his bravado, seemed to sense it. He lingered at the microphone, waiting for reaction, applause, pushback, anything. But the room didn't give him what he wanted. They were watching something else now. Because at the far end of the table, Ibrahim Traoré was beginning to move. Slow, measured, intentional. Trump had made his play, but what he didn't know, what none of them yet knew, was that in trying to dominate the conversation, he had just handed Traoré the stage. Not with permission, but with necessity. And when the young president finally stood to speak, he wouldn't need to raise his voice. The silence would do that for him. The tension didn't erupt. It crept. After Trump's final words, "The least you could do is say thank you," a strange, palpable pause fell over the room. Not the respectful silence of diplomacy, but something tighter, more uncertain. Like the moment before glass breaks, when everything still appears intact but the cracks are already there, waiting. It wasn't just what Trump said, it was how he said it. There was no buffer of tact, no nod to nuance, no soft edge of diplomatic phrasing. It had been a raw declaration, direct, transactional, and unfiltered. And that unfiltered tone, in a room built on protocol, landed like a spark in dry grass. The air felt denser. Even the chandeliers, with their glistening crystal strands, seemed to dim ever so slightly under the collective shift in mood. Body language changed subtly. Crossed arms, stiffened backs, lips pressed thinner. It was the kind of discomfort that didn't announce itself, but filled every corner of the auditorium. From his position at the center, Trump remained standing, perhaps still waiting for applause, or perhaps daring anyone to challenge him. His eyes scanned the room again, but what once might have been dominance now hovered uncomfortably close to provocation. To Trump's left, French President Emmanuel Macron sat motionless, his jaw tight. His pen, which moments earlier had danced across a notepad, now lay untouched. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz leaned forward slightly, eyes fixed on the table, his fingers tapping a slow, distracted rhythm, as if recalculating something in his head. Giorgia Meloni of Italy exhaled quietly and adjusted her earpiece, though no translation was playing. The Canadian Prime Minister turned his gaze downward, momentarily studying his folded hands. Even seasoned diplomats who had weathered years of delicate negotiations found themselves caught between two instincts: maintain composure or respond. The moderator, Klaus Miller, adjusted his microphone and cleared his throat, his hand hovering just above the panel's cue button. He had seen awkward moments before, poorly worded answers, mistranslations, cultural stumbles. But this was different. This was deliberate. He glanced quickly at his note cards as if hoping to find a script for exactly this moment, and finding none, simply waited. From the press gallery above, cameras pivoted into action. Operators began zooming in, capturing reactions rather than rhetoric. This was no longer about speeches, it was about faces. A close-up on Macron's clenched jaw. A slow pan to a West African delegate's narrowed eyes. A tight shot of the Japanese Prime Minister whispering something urgent to his interpreter. Journalists scribbled rapidly. Laptops clicked like nervous insects. One reporter mouthed the word "wow" without realizing she'd done it. Another leaned into a colleague and muttered, "This just became the story." And then, like a thin thread snapping in a quiet room, a low murmur began. It started in the second row, among development bank officials and trade advisors. Small, hushed exchanges, careful not to break decorum but too urgent to suppress. Some questioned the implications. Others simply expressed disbelief. One leaned over and said, barely audible, "Did he really just say that to the whole continent?" Traoré hadn't moved yet. He remained seated, still at the edge of the table, his body language unchanged. But his stillness now held weight. His hands were clasped loosely in front of him, thumbs gently circling each other. His gaze didn't falter, locked squarely on Trump. Not in defiance, but in observation, as if analyzing more than reacting. He hadn't flinched, and that absence of reaction, in a room brimming with discomfort, was almost unsettling in its discipline. Across the table, a delegate from Ghana glanced toward Traoré, then looked away quickly, as if afraid of being caught reading his expression. A South American representative whispered something to his assistant, his tone a mix of surprise and restrained excitement. It was as though everyone had sensed that something was coming, but didn't yet know how big it would be. Back at the moderator's desk, Mueller briefly leaned toward his microphone, then hesitated. He looked left, then right, silently weighing the risk of moving the conversation forward too quickly. The panel was only halfway through its agenda, but it was clear no one cared about bullet points anymore. The summit had shifted from a controlled narrative to an unscripted reckoning. Trump finally returned to his seat, the scrape of his chair loud in the stillness. He adjusted his cuffs, cleared his throat with theatrical finality, then folded his arms, apparently satisfied. But the room wasn't settled. It was suspended, hanging between the shock of what had been said and the uncertainty of what would follow. The murmurs continued, just loud enough to feel like thunder from beneath the surface. And at the edge of it all, Ibrahim Traoré blinked once, exhaled softly, and reached for his microphone. Not yet, but soon. The air in the room had barely settled before Trump leaned back into his microphone, his tone now sharper, more pointed, less like a speech and more like a verdict. "You know, I wasn't going to name names," he said with a chuckle that didn't invite laughter. "But let's talk straight for once. Enough of this politically correct garbage." A few leaders shifted uncomfortably. Others froze. Trump's gaze slid down the table like a laser until it landed unmistakably on the far left seat. "There are people in this room," he continued, "some of these so-called young revolutionaries, who think they can rewrite history with a few angry speeches and military uniforms." He didn't need to say Traoré's name. Every eye had already turned. "They act like they've rebuilt their countries from the ground up with no help, no support, just grit and courage," Trump scoffed. "But let me remind you, the only reason you can stand on that platform, the only reason you have roads to drive on, airports to fly out of, electricity to live stream your grievances, is because the West built it. We did that." He jabbed a finger down at the table for emphasis, his voice rising just enough to make the microphones buzz slightly. "We poured in aid, infrastructure, expertise, and all we get back is bitterness, accusations, no gratitude. Seriously, what happened to respect?" Now he was fully animated. His hands cut the air like blades. "We deserve thanks," he said plainly. "At the very least, respect for what we've contributed. The truth is, many of you wouldn't even be here if not for what America and its allies have invested over the last 50 years. He turned again toward Traoré, this time not with implication, but with direct address. "And yet some of you," he said, pausing as if choosing his words, though the edge in his voice was anything but careful, "want to act like we're the oppressors, like we've done nothing but take. Well, let me ask, what exactly have you built without us?" It was a shot across the bow, aimed not only at Traoré, but at every leader in the room under 50. Every country still listed as developing, every movement that dared question the price of foreign aid. But Traoré didn't react. He didn't blink. He didn't shift. He didn't reach for his microphone. He simply sat there, hands resting calmly on the table, his face an expressionless mask that gave nothing away. He absorbed every word like stone absorbs rain, quietly, heavily, without letting it sink too deep. His eyes didn't glare, but they didn't soften either. He was listening, not to respond, not yet, but to understand the full shape of what had just been said. Across the table, several leaders now glanced between Trump and Traoré, tension mounting in their expressions. It was as if the whole room had leaned in together, holding its collective breath, waiting for the next move in a game no longer diplomatic, but deeply personal. Trump sat back again, arms folded. His statement was complete. His challenge had been issued. Now the silence belonged to Traoré, and the world waited to hear what silence would become. He didn't rush. He didn't shift in agitation or lean forward dramatically. He simply placed both hands flat on the table, deliberate, steady, and pushed himself to his feet with the calm precision of someone who understood exactly what he was doing. No theatrics, no defiance, just movement so measured, so intentional, that it felt louder than anything spoken so far. President Ibrahim Traoré rose not like a man about to speak, but like a man about to carry something heavy, something ancient. The gesture was simple, but its effect was electric. Chairs stopped creaking, pens stopped scratching, glasses of water were left untouched, halfway to lips. The kind of stillness that filled the room wasn't born of politeness. It was expectation, primal, collective, undeniable. He didn't adjust his uniform. He didn't clear his throat or check his notes. He had no script in front of him, no printed statement, no whispered advisor feeding him phrases. He had only the room, the microphone, and his silence. And what a silence it was. It wasn't the passive silence of hesitation. It was the charged silence of calculation. The kind that builds pressure like a storm forming just over the horizon. The kind that pulls every eye toward it without needing to raise a voice or lift a hand. All across the hall, something in the atmosphere had shifted. The light seemed colder, the air heavier. No one spoke, yet something unspeakable was being acknowledged. Even the moderator, Klaus Miller, sat frozen, his hands tented before his lips, as if afraid that even the smallest movement might disturb the unfolding of a moment not yet born, but already breathing. Traoré's gaze swept across the table, slow and unwavering. He didn't glare, didn't stare anyone down. Instead, he looked, really looked at each face one by one, with the unsettling stillness of someone who sees not just positions and titles, but intentions. He passed over the European leaders, the bankers, the philanthropists, and finally his eyes landed on Trump, not as an enemy, but as a symbol, not of America, but of an idea, a way of doing things, a way of ruling. And then he waited. He didn't speak right away. Seconds passed, then more. In a conference hall where every moment was scheduled to the minute, this open, deliberate delay felt almost subversive. But no one dared interrupt. The silence grew so thick it was as if sound itself had been forbidden. Even the faint hum of the air conditioning seemed to hold its breath. The cameras, now fully locked on Traoré, zoomed in instinctively. His face, illuminated by stage lights, betrayed no emotion. Neither anger nor fear. Only focus, control, and something else, harder to name, a kind of sovereign stillness, like a river that had waited centuries to overflow. Across the room, journalists sat poised, unsure whether to write yet. Security guards, normally impassive, were now watching him more than the crowd. Some aides whispered nervously to each other, though none dared raise their voice above the invisible line the moment had drawn. Even Trump, who just minutes earlier had filled the room with dominance and noise, sat oddly quiet. His arms were still folded, but his posture had changed. A slight lean forward, a shift in his brow. Perhaps it was curiosity, or perhaps, for the first time, something closer to caution. Because Traoré hadn't said a word, and yet somehow he had already spoken volumes. This was not the silence of submission. This was the silence before the reply. The moment a lion stands not to roar, but simply to be seen. And every second it stretched, the room bent further toward him, gravity shifting not by force, but by inevitability. Then softly, finally, he leaned just a fraction forward toward the microphone, and the world, already breathless, leaned with him. Not because they expected him to shout, but because, somehow, they knew he wouldn't have to. Traoré's voice, when it finally emerged, was a low tenor, steady, almost gentle. No thunder, no accusation in his tone. Yet the first sentence sliced through the frozen air with surgical precision. "You gave us money," he said, pausing just long enough for the echo of his words to find every corner of the hall. "Yes, but with every dollar, you took dignity." The phrase hung there, stark and irretrievable. A dozen laptops snapped open. Reporters typed as though afraid the words might evaporate. On the lower floor, a delegate from Senegal closed his eyes as if bracing for impact. Across the table, Macron's pen began tapping, slow, nervy staccato. Traoré did not raise his volume. He didn't need to. Every ear had already tuned itself to his frequency. "You built hospitals," he continued, "but you wrote our healthcare policies, deciding which lives were worth the latest medicine and which could wait." His gaze drifted toward a pharmaceutical CEO seated in the second row. The man shifted, suddenly too aware of the cameras. "You laid asphalt on our roads," Traoré went on, "yet each contract insisted we purchase the machinery, the fuel, the expertise from you." He lifted a hand, palm up, as if weighing an invisible burden. "A gift that sends the bill back to the recipient is not a gift. It is a leash." Murmurs rippled along the press gallery. Some delegates looked down, refusing eye contact. Others, mostly from the global south, nodded ever so slightly, as though recognizing their own stories in his words. "You delivered grain during droughts," he said softly, "but required that we open our markets to your surplus crops, the same crops that undercut our farmers once the crisis was over." A flicker of sorrow crossed his features, quickly mastered. Short-term breath for long-term dependency. He let the point linger before turning to another ledger of hidden costs. "You offer loans," Traoré said, voice still measured, "then peg repayment to currencies you control, interest rates you decide, arbitration courts you staff. When we default, you claim our ports, our power grids, our future revenue." His eyes found a World Bank official. The official's shoulders tightened. The room was silent except for the faint whir of camera lenses zooming in, capturing every restrained emotion on the leaders' faces. You call this partnership, Traoré said, but partnership requires consent without coercion. It requires equality of choice. His gaze swept the table again. When the only options are accept or collapse, there is no choice. There is only compliance. A delegate from Kenya lowered his head, one hand covering his mouth. Near the back, a representative from Bolivia whispered, "Exactamente," to her colleague. Even a few Western aides, notebooks poised, exchanged uneasy glances. Traoré took a breath, not to steady himself, but to steady the room. "I am not dismissing the lives your aid has saved," he said, voice softening. "I have walked through clinics funded by your generosity. I have seen children alive today because vaccines arrived in time." He let a hint of warmth enter his tone, acknowledging genuine help. "But I have also watched those same clinics run out of supplies because the donor cycle moved on. I have seen farmers priced out of their own markets. I have seen parliaments pass laws written in languages their citizens do not speak because grant money demanded it." He straightened, shoulders square under the plain green fabric of his uniform. "Aid that rescues a life today, yet robs a nation tomorrow is not mercy. It is mortgage." A ripple of discomfort swept the Western Bloc. Yet in that same heartbeat, a low affirmation, half sigh, half hum, rose from the rows of smaller nations. A shared, unspoken recognition. Traoré allowed the room a moment to absorb the ledger he had laid bare. Then almost kindly, he concluded this section with a simple summary, each word enunciated as though chiseling stone. "Assistance offered with strings," he said, "is simply another form of ownership. Ownership wrapped in ribbons and press releases." No one clapped. No one dared. Instead, the delegates sat in suspended awareness, the weight of unvarnished truth pressing against their polished veneers. Some faces flushed, others paled, but a few, those accustomed to translating silence into strategy, nodded quietly, resolutely. Traoré let the echoes of his last sentence fade until the room steadied enough for the next blow. Then, with the composure of a surgeon making the decisive cut, he spoke again. Each word slow, deliberate, final. "So today," he said, "I return both. The money you tally in spreadsheets and the gratitude you tally in headlines." The phrase landed with a dull, resonant thud, as if someone had placed a stone on glass. Heads lifted in disbelief. Aides who had been dutifully noting every syllable now hesitated, pens suspended midair, unsure how to record something that sounded almost impossible in diplomatic circles, built on perpetual need. He did not stop there. "Aid," Traoré continued, "is not charity when it comes with chains." His voice neither rose nor trembled. It carried the quiet surety of a verdict already signed. A chain may be made of silk instead of iron, but it still binds. A gift may arrive in a velvet box, but if the lid never opens without your permission, it is still a cage. He lifted his right hand, palm outward, not in refusal but in release. "Keep the box. Keep the ribbon. Keep the narrative that tells the world we were saved by someone else's generosity. We decline that story, and we decline the debt of gratitude scripted into its final chapter." A tension as palpable as humidity gathered over the polished table. He addressed the donors without contempt, but without apology either. "If partnership is what you truly want, let it begin when both sides can walk away without penalty. Let it begin when the return on investment is measured in shared prosperity, not leveraged obedience. Until then, your money, and the expectations sewn into each coin, remains yours to spend elsewhere." The metaphor of coins felt almost archaic in a world of digital transfers and multi-year grants, yet it struck home. It reminded every financier present that resources and relationships can be withdrawn as quickly as they are deposited. Traoré drew a final breath, then offered a closing sentence so simple it felt preordained. "Dignity isn't an add-on, it is the ground we stand on. We will not trade it again." And with that, he stepped back, fingers returning to rest lightly on the table's edge, shoulders straight, eyes unblinking. Silence followed, an absence of sound so absolute it seemed to hum. No scattered applause dared interrupt it, no throat cleared to break the spell. Even the cameras still recording felt intrusive. their red tally lights blinking like embarrassed witnesses. Trump, arms folded, shifted once but found no words. The habitual retort, the practiced counterpunch, simply did not arrive. Around the room, some delegates stared at their nameplates, others at their shoes as if seeking refuge from a truth suddenly too bright to look at. Yet in the back rows, a handful of representatives, small nations long dismissed in negotiations, allowed the faintest nods, acknowledgments exchanged in the hush of shared experience. The moderator's microphone remained unused. He understood instinctively that any prompt to proceed would clang against the moment like a dropped cymbal in a requiem. And so the hall remained suspended, time elongating, the chandeliers casting their cold constellations over faces caught between shock and revelation. It was not the polite silence of protocol. It was the reverent quiet reserved for seismic shifts, when a paradigm surrenders to a single sentence and the future waits, breath held, to see what the world will do next. The silence that followed Traoré's final words didn't dissipate quickly. It fractured. Not with applause, not with rebuttal, but with something more subtle and far more powerful. Reaction. It started with a shifting of posture. Delegates straightened in their chairs, as if physically adjusting to the weight of what they had just witnessed. Some leaned forward, elbows planted on polished wood, trying to hide their stunned expressions behind folded hands. Others leaned back, eyes fixed on the ceiling as if searching for some escape hatch in the chandeliers. No one knew what to say, because everything that needed to be said had just been spoken, with humility, fury, and truth fused into a single, unforgettable delivery. Even Donald Trump, whose public persona had been forged in relentless reaction, appeared briefly, just briefly, disarmed. His arms, once confidently folded across his chest, now rested awkwardly at his sides. He blinked twice, opened his mouth, then closed it again. The words which usually leapt from him like arrows simply weren't there. For a man who measured dominance in volume, the hush that now surrounded him was its own kind of defeat. Up in the press gallery, the opposite was happening. Silence had never been an option for journalists, and now their fingers were flying across keyboards like a thunderstorm. Screens glowed as reporters simultaneously typed, tweeted, recorded, and whispered into headsets. Some tried to paraphrase Traoré's final lines. Others simply posted them verbatim. One journalist from Al Jazeera whispered urgently into her mic, "This is no longer a policy forum, it's a reckoning. Ibrahim Traoré just redrew the map of moral authority." Within minutes, Twitter, still buzzing from earlier outbursts, detonated. The phrase "I return both" exploded onto feeds in capital letters, bold font, in every language imaginable. Users clipped the moment into 30-second segments, overlaying them with fire emojis, clapping GIFs, and side-by-side images comparing Traoré to other historic truth-tellers. In Lagos, Nairobi, and Johannesburg, influencers reposted the clip with the caption, "He didn't just speak for Burkina Faso, he spoke for all of us." The hashtag I return both began trending globally within 18 minutes. In the time it took for the moderator to finally clear his throat again, over 300,000 tweets had been posted. By the time the panel officially recessed 5 minutes later, that number had doubled. Instagram Reels, YouTube Shorts, TikTok duets with young Africans staring into their phones and mouthing Traoré's words like a new national anthem. It wasn't just going viral, it was mutating into a movement. Inside the conference hall, the ripple effect was equally dramatic. Delegates who had once looked past Traoré now glanced at him with something between respect and awe. Some nodded discreetly. A few quietly slid handwritten notes across to neighboring seats. Short sentences like, "That changes everything," or "We need to rethink our position." At the back of the room, a senior official from the African Union stood up and exited early. Not out of protest, but purpose. She had already begun texting her chief of staff. Draft response, dignity-focused aid model, Traoré's language, copy word for word. Not everyone was celebratory. In the row reserved for private sector observers, a European banking executive whispered to a UN official, "We have exposure in Burkina Faso. Should we be concerned?" The UN official didn't answer. His eyes hadn't moved from Traoré's face. Even the moderator, Klaus Miller, seasoned as he was, fumbled slightly as he returned to the microphone. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, "perhaps we'll take a short recess." It was the most unnecessary sentence of the day. Everyone had already begun packing up, or not moving at all, frozen in the kind of collective aftershock that only truth can deliver. As Traoré stepped away from the table, he didn't walk like a man who had just delivered a mic drop moment. He walked like someone who had simply fulfilled a responsibility. No fist pumps, no nods to the crowd, just quiet, unbroken momentum. Trump remained seated, watching, his expression unreadable. Perhaps it was disbelief. Perhaps for the first time, it was introspection. And above them, far beyond the opulence of chandeliers and carved panels, a new kind of spotlight had begun to form. Not one built by media or money, but by millions of people finally seeing themselves reflected in the defiant dignity of one man's voice. The speech may have ended in Geneva, but its echo reached Accra before sunrise. By the time the morning sun touched the golden dome of Ghana's Parliament House, Ibrahim Traoré's words had already been downloaded, translated, remixed, and pasted onto dorm room walls. By noon, students at the University of Ghana had turned the main quad into a sea of printed quotes. "Aid is not charity when it comes with chains. We return both. Dignity isn't an add-on." In the art district of Jamestown, young graffiti artists stayed up all night transforming entire alleyways into murals of Traoré's calm face, staring outward beneath bold, blood-red slogans. "Dignity first" and "Speak soft, strike deep." Some artists painted him with a microphone. Others rendered him in traditional African robes, holding a broken chain in one hand and a seedling in the other. The iconography wasn't about hero worship. It was about reflection. He had said what they all felt, but had never heard at a summit mic. In Nairobi, hundreds of university students marched peacefully from Kenyatta University to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, carrying placards that simply read, "We're not for sale." The chants weren't angry. They were steady, rhythmic, purposeful. A voice from a megaphone read Traoré's speech aloud in Swahili, phrase by phrase, and the crowd echoed it back in unison, not like protesters, but like a choir reclaiming a stolen hymn. At the University of Ibadan in Nigeria, a history professor paused midway through a lecture on post-colonial economics and opened his laptop to play the full video. After the last sentence, "We return both," he closed the lid, looked at his students, and said quietly, "This is our Gettysburg Address." There was no debate, only stunned silence, then the sound of chairs shifting as students rose in spontaneous applause. Across social media, the sentiment crystallized into something more organized. African TikTokers started a trend, using Traoré's speech layered over clips of local farmers, shopkeepers, teachers, and students, all people whose lives were tangled in the quiet, invisible terms of foreign aid. The trend was tagged, #NotWithChains. On Instagram, the phrase "dignity first" became more than a slogan. It became a filter. Users overlaid it onto profile pictures, protest signs, graduation photos, and even receipts from repaid microloans, symbolizing a break from dependence. In Cape Town, a grassroots coalition of youth leaders from South Africa, Namibia, and Zimbabwe launched an open manifesto titled "The Dignity Doctrine," a 3-page document outlining a vision for African development led by Africans for Africans. No more donor-dictated policy, no more compliance tied to survival. Their language wasn't radical. It was principled, focused, and clear. They quoted Traoré's Geneva Address like scripture. "We do not refuse assistance. We refuse the assumption that assistance requires the surrender of dignity." But it wasn't all academic or online. In Dakar, a local dance crew choreographed a performance titled "Return Both," combining traditional West African movement with spoken-word excerpts from the speech. It was performed in front of the French embassy, not with hostility, but with elegance, turning performance into protest without shouting a word. In Kigali, a group of young coders built a website in under 24 hours that archived the speech, translated it into 14 African languages, and allowed users to submit their own dignity stories, accounts of how aid, however well-intentioned, had sometimes come at the cost of autonomy. The stories poured in, nurses forced to use donated equipment incompatible with local systems, teachers retrained to teach curriculums designed overseas, small businesses locked out of markets due to subsidized imports. It was no longer just a speech. It was a mirror, a spark, a roadmap. Even older generations, who had lived through independence and watched its promises fade, felt something stir. In Addis Ababa, a retired diplomat reportedly told his grandson, "We used to speak like that, before we were told it was impolite." And perhaps that was the greatest shift of all. Not the noise, not the hashtags, not the murals, but the realization that politeness had long been mistaken for peace, and that maybe, just maybe, dignity required a different kind of voice, one that didn't ask for permission to be heard. Back in Washington, the corridors of power were unusually quiet, not because people weren't working, but because no one knew what to say. In the White House press briefing room, staffers huddled in back offices, parsing transcripts of Traoré's speech, watching the viral clips on loop, looking for some angle that would make their president appear composed, calculated, in control. But there was nothing. There was no spin for a moment when a world leader had stared into the eyes of a superpower and said without shouting, "We return both." Trump's senior communications director slammed his laptop shut. "He made it look like aid is exploitation," he muttered, and somehow it landed. Their inboxes were flooded, not with congratulations, but with questions. From diplomats, donors, minority leaders, even some corporate sponsors of foreign projects. Everyone was asking, what just happened? Meanwhile, Fox News wasted no time trying to reclaim the narrative. That evening, in a primetime segment titled "The Ingratitude of Africa," the network's most bombastic anchor pointed his finger at the screen and barked, "This so-called president of Burkina Faso has the gall to insult the greatest donor nation in human history. We give them roads, medicine, food, and what do we get? Condescension. That's not courage. That's delusion." But the backlash came quickly, and not just from African audiences. Prominent African American leaders, civil rights activists, and even some conservative pundits pushed back. On CNN, a historian calmly responded, "When someone finally tells the truth about imbalanced relationships, we should listen, not attack." Traoré didn't deny help. He rejected humiliation. The contrast between reactions across the Atlantic was striking. In Berlin, Chancellor Olaf Scholz reportedly called an emergency meeting with his development ministry. According to a leak published 2 days later in Der Spiegel, he opened the session by saying, "If what he said is even half true, then we've built our entire policy on sand." By the end of the week, Germany quietly announced a full audit of its African development initiatives with a specific directive: assess dignity impact. This wasn't PR, it was policy correction, and they weren't alone. In Paris, Emmanuel Macron convened his Africa Advisory Council. An insider described the tone of the meeting as rattled. Macron, who had sat stiffly through Traoré's remarks, now spoke candidly to his team. "The days of calling it partnership while dictating every term are over. We must change, not because we've been embarrassed, but because we've been exposed." The French Foreign Ministry began drafting new protocols for bilateral agreements. "No more conditional aid disguised as generosity," read one internal memo. "We must engage with sovereignty, not superiority." But as European leaders scrambled for introspection and adaptation, Washington found itself trapped between ego and evolution. Trump's inner circle remained divided. Some advisors pushed him to strike back hard, paint Traoré as an ungrateful radical, double down on the rhetoric of investment and control. Others begged for restraint, warning that an aggressive response would only confirm the criticisms already exploding across social media. What neither camp could deny was this: a crack had formed, not just in the room in Geneva, but in the entire moral edifice the West had used to justify its global authority. And the most terrifying part? The question no one wanted to say out loud, but that now echoed through think tanks, editorial rooms, and closed-door briefings alike. Are we the problem? For decades, Western nations had written the aid narrative. They were the givers, the helpers, the architects of global good. But now, with just a few calmly delivered sentences, that script had been challenged. Not torn up, but laid bare. And in that uncomfortable clarity, the West found itself exposed not as villain or hero, but as something far more complicated. A partner afraid of letting go of the leash. The world was shifting, and not at the margins. This wasn't reform, it was a reckoning. And for once, the West didn't seem ready. In the hushed cabinet room of the Jubilee House in Accra, President Nana Akufo-Addo sat in silence, the morning sunlight painting golden rectangles across the polished mahogany table. He had watched the full Geneva exchange 3 times. Not the condensed viral clip, the entire moment, from Trump's first interruption to Traoré's final breath before sitting down. The room had been filled with ministers waiting for his reaction. When he finally spoke, his voice was low but certain. He said what we couldn't, and maybe what we should have said long ago. Around the continent, similar moments of reflection unfolded in quiet offices, presidential compounds, and think tank halls. The Geneva confrontation had become more than a story. It was a litmus test, and one by one, African leaders were asking themselves, had they been too silent for too long? In Nairobi, Kenyan President William Ruto summoned his economic and foreign policy teams to an emergency retreat at State House. The meeting agenda was titled simply Aid, Reset, or Repeat. During the session, a junior advisor, barely 30, stood up and said, "What Traoré did wasn't rebellion. It was clarity. And our people heard it. No one disagreed." Within a week, Kenya announced it would review all ongoing foreign aid programs, specifically those tied to education and agriculture. In a press statement that felt anything but bureaucratic, the Kenyan Minister of Foreign Affairs declared, "We welcome support, but support must not rewrite our national priorities. No more ghost-written futures." In Kinshasa, the Democratic Republic of Congo, long plagued by extractive aid deals and skewed resource-sharing contracts, took an even bolder step. President Felix Tshisekedi's administration formally paused negotiations with 2 major donor agencies, citing a failure to meet sovereignty benchmarks. Behind closed doors, a Congolese official was blunt. If they're serious about partnership, they'll wait. If they're not, then we've learned what kind of partner they were all along. Back in Burkina Faso, Traoré remained characteristically silent amid the global storm his speech had unleashed. He declined interview requests, avoided podiums, and issued no formal victory statement. He didn't need to, because at this point, he wasn't just a man, he was a symbol. In classrooms across Lusaka, Dar es Salaam, and Addis Ababa, professors began citing him not just as a political figure, but as a rhetorical strategist, a post-colonial theorist in uniform. High school debate teams adopted the structure of his speech as a case study in assertive dignity. Activists across Senegal and Côte d'Ivoire printed his words on shirts, bumper stickers, even water bottles. But perhaps most telling were the whispered acknowledgments behind closed doors. A former African head of state, now retired, confided to a journalist over coffee, "We always knew the game was rigged, but we played it anyway. Now, the rules are being questioned." He paused, then smiled sadly. And it took someone young, someone uninvited to the center, to say it out loud. In Lagos, a coalition of civil society organizations launched a campaign under the name Traoré's Echo. Their mission? Not to idolize, but to amplify. They gathered testimonials from small farmers whose equipment was incompatible with donor machinery, from doctors forced to follow protocols written in French or English textbooks rather than local reality, from teachers required to use foreign-approved syllabi that erased indigenous knowledge. Each story began the same way. They helped us, yes, but. The aid industry was now on trial, not for its intentions, but for its outcomes. And for the first time in decades, African leaders weren't speaking from a place of need, but from a position of choice. Because Traoré had done something radical in its simplicity. He had redefined the power dynamic, not with a coup, not with violence, but with language, with calm defiance, with a statement that had turned a continent's frustration into a global conversation. And now leaders were finally listening, not just to him, but to their people. It didn't take long for the tremors from Geneva to reach the glass towers of Paris La Défense. Inside Total Energy's headquarters, An emergency board meeting convened 2 days after Traoré's speech. The agenda, printed on thick, watermarked paper, read like a declaration of crisis. Contract vulnerabilities in West Africa. Exposure assessment. In a room ringed with stock tickers and world maps, the CEO reviewed a dossier thicker than many annual reports. Pages of concessions, royalty schemes, and stabilization clauses suddenly labeled high risk. One line in red ink caught every director's eye. Potential renegotiations aligned to dignity first doctrine. Nobody had used the phrase dignity first in a corporate memo before. Now it appeared 12 times in 40 pages. Across Europe, similar scenes played out. Mining executives in London's Canary Wharf held late-night calls with general counsels, scrambling to gauge whether once routine agreements, 30-year leases, tax holidays, profit-sharing formulas, could survive a political climate where sovereignty had become the new benchmark of legitimacy. An iron ore giant postponed a shareholder roadshow after its social media feed filled with comments demanding to know how it would respond to the Traoré effect, a phrase coined by a Financial Times columnist to capture the sudden spike in reputational risk attached to lopsided deals. Boards had faced activist investors before. What they hadn't faced was a movement that merged moral clarity with market impact. Within a week, a sovereign wealth fund in the Gulf quietly put 2 African infrastructure projects under review because local governments were reconsidering terms. Venture capital firms in Silicon Valley held webinars titled Sovereignty Premiums, Pricing New Realities, warning startups that expansion plans premised on cheap land or concessional tariffs might evaporate overnight. One analyst quipped on Twitter, "If your pitch deck's exit strategy depends on outdated power dynamics, update the slide or delete the deal." Bloomberg terminals lit up with a new risk metric, DPV, dignity, perceived volatility. It wasn't official, but traders began to cite it in chat rooms when explaining sudden dips in resource-linked equities. Copper down 2%, DPV surge after Nairobi statement, became shorthand for a phenomenon once dismissed as sentiment, but now tracked like weather. Inside a Zurich private equity conference, a partner from a renowned firm addressed a room of anxious investors. "Look, we can complain about moral grandstanding, or we can admit that sovereignty now carries a price tag. If you want in, prepare to pay it. Transparent tax structures, local ownership quotas, technology transfer clauses. Otherwise, your project won't even make it to a ribbon cutting." Some corporations pivoted quickly. A Scandinavian telecom announced profit sharing with a regional university network, framing it as co-innovation rather than philanthropy. A French agribusiness giant offered to convert a portion of annual dividends into seed grants managed by local cooperatives, something unthinkable a month earlier. Their legal teams didn't call it altruism, they called it risk mitigation. But not everyone adapted. In Houston, an oil services CEO told shareholders he refused to renegotiate under populist pressure. The stock fell 7% in a single session, prompting a downgrade from 2 rating agencies that cited strategic inflexibility and a jurisdictional realignment. Translation? The company had failed to read the room, and the room was now the globe. Investment bankers tried to quantify the shift. Preliminary models suggested that projects in West and Central Africa would need an average 15% increase in upfront local equity and community benefit guarantees to remain politically viable, a figure now referred to in briefings as the sovereignty surcharge. One strategist summed it up in a memo. "The age of off-balance sheet goodwill is over. From here on, dignity is an invoice item." Meanwhile, Traoré himself issued no statement, appeared at no ribbon cuttings. Yet in boardrooms, his name surfaced more than any CEO in the Fortune 500. PowerPoints labeled Geneva Impact opened with his silhouette against the summit backdrop, a single pull quote beneath. "Aid that rescues a life today, yet robs a nation tomorrow is not mercy. It is mortgage." Business as usual wasn't just shaken, it was recalculated. The equations still balanced. Capital would still chase opportunity, but the variables had changed. Sovereignty had become a cost center, dignity a line item, and any model that ignored them now looked obsolete before the first cell of a spreadsheet finished loading. Across the Andes, a chill dawn painted the snowcaps rose gold when Maria Santos, an Aymara community leader from Bolivia's high plateau, opened a crackling radio broadcast that reached a dozen mountain villages. She read Traoré's lines slowly, translating it into Quechua so even the oldest farmers could taste its meaning. Aid that arrives with chains is not kindness. Then she added in her own voice, "We have felt those chains in every seed we buy, every road we cannot afford to maintain." By noon, local weavers had stitched a new slogan into their bright aguayo cloth: Kapak Taka, dignity first. Within days, murals of condor-headed figures snapping shackles appeared in La Paz and Quito, each tagged with a simple hashtag, Volvemos con Dignidad, we return with dignity. Thousands of miles west in the Philippines, Senator Althea Cruz stood on the Senate floor holding a printed copy of Traoré's speech. "Let us adopt the Geneva Principles," she declared, coining a term that would ricochet through Manila talk shows and college campuses. Her resolution urged that any future loan or grant be vetted for sovereignty compliance, language lifted directly from Traoré's quiet indictments. In Jakarta, a coalition of Southeast Asian NGOs released a joint statement echoing the same three pillars: transparent terms, mutual exit rights, and cultural respect. For once, regional rivals found common cause, not against each other, but against the price tags hidden inside foreign benevolence. Across the Caribbean, the response was less formal but equally fierce. In Kingston, reggae artist Ja Rama dropped a surprise single titled "Return Both," splicing Traoré's baritone into the hook. "We return both, D-Money and Die-Leash." The track dominated island radio, its heavy bass vibrating taxi dashboards from Nassau to Port of Spain. Activists in Barbados organized a beachfront chain-breaking festival where participants melted symbolic padlocks and steel drums, chanting, "No strings, no stings, dignity rings." What united these disparate reactions was not nostalgia or nationalism, but a freshly shared vocabulary. Dignity was no longer a philosophical noun. It had become an actionable metric, a yardstick to hold against every memorandum and white paper promise. Rural cooperatives in Guatemala began labeling their coffee DP certified, short for Dignity Principles, assuring buyers that profits stayed local and no hidden conditions lurked behind the export contract. A Bangladeshi microfinance network updated its borrower charter to include a clause, "No policy shall diminish the cultural agency of its members." It cited Article 3 of the Geneva Principles, a document still unofficial yet already treated like international law. Newsrooms coined new headlines: "Post-aid politics, the diplomacy of self-respect, from recipient to partner." At conferences, speakers who once opened with GDP graphs now opened with stories of farmers refusing seed packages bundled with patents, or fishing villages rejecting refrigerated depots that required exclusive licensing deals. Traoré's calm refrain, "Dignity isn't an add-on, it is the ground we stand on," echoed not as rhetoric, but as the simplest kind of instruction. In the span of weeks, a speech delivered by a soft-spoken soldier in Geneva had skipped borders, translations, and ideologies, settling into hearts as a demand both ancient and brand new. Help that heals must never handcuff. And in plazas, studios, parliaments, in village squares, people were no longer asking whether that demand was realistic. They were asking, sometimes with paintbrushes, sometimes with policy drafts, how soon it could become the only deal anyone would dare to offer. When the headlines faded and the applause softened into history, Ibrahim Traoré turned his attention not to interviews, but to infrastructure. Geneva had been a moment. Now came the movement. Within 2 months of the summit, his team launched what would become the heart of a new African doctrine, the Dignity Development Fund, DDF. It was not just another aid package or coalition of donors. It was something the continent hadn't truly seen before. A financial instrument owned, governed, and operated by Africans, for Africans, with one guiding rule: no strings attached. The seed capital came not from foreign governments, but from a surprising mix of African central banks, diaspora investors, and sovereign wealth funds. Ghana, Kenya, Senegal, Rwanda, Namibia, and even landlocked Malawi contributed. No state held majority control. Even grassroots cooperatives were allowed representation on the fund's advisory board. The fund's mission was simple: empower self-sustaining solutions in technology, health, and agriculture, where Africa had always been told it needed help, but where innovation had long simmered beneath the surface. Within weeks, success stories began to surface. A team of Nigerian software engineers unveiled a mobile health application that allowed rural clinics to share diagnostic resources in real time, drastically reducing maternal mortality. In Ethiopia, farmers deployed solar-powered irrigation systems developed by a local startup with DDF grants, systems that used AI-driven soil sensors, not imported Western equipment. And in Burkina Faso itself, a young group of engineers launched SoleilSat, a low-cost satellite monitoring project to help track desertification in real time. Traoré visited the control room wearing his military fatigues and told the press simply, "We no longer wait for experts to arrive, we grow our own." It wasn't just the innovation, it was the tone. There was no deference in these speeches, no careful thanks extended to unnamed benefactors. Instead, a new lexicon emerged: mutuality, sovereignty, and value-added partnership. At one press conference, Traoré stood before reporters from Reuters, Al Jazeera, and the BBC and declared with disarming calm, "We don't need saviors, we need fair partners. The era of begging for dignity is over." The words traveled faster than any policy paper. In Nairobi, students printed them on banners. In Johannesburg, a billboard campaign launched featuring African scientists and farmers under the caption, "We build, we heal, we lead." Of course, criticism came quickly. Western economists warned of inefficiency and mismanagement. Some accused the DDF of nationalism disguised as reform, but the numbers began to speak for themselves. Where foreign aid programs had often spent 30 to 40% of budgets on foreign consultants and logistics, the DDF boasted a 90% reinvestment rate in African talent and resources. A study by the University of Cape Town showed that for every $1 invested by the fund, $3.70 in local value was generated within 6 months, nearly double the return of comparable World Bank projects in the same sectors. More profoundly, the DDF triggered a shift in mindset. Across the continent, a new generation of innovators and thinkers began treating foreign aid not as a lifeline, but as a tool that could be declined. The Dignity First doctrine was no longer just rhetoric, it was policy. Ministries of development started auditing all external partnerships through a sovereignty lens. If a deal required importing 80% of its workforce or forced policy changes, it was declined. Instead of cutting off the world, Africa was redefining the terms of entry. Ibrahim Traoré's Geneva speech had not asked the world to go away. It had asked the world to listen differently. And now, with solar panels rising where handouts once landed, and satellites launched by students instead of donors, that difference was becoming impossible to ignore. Africa had not rejected partnership. It had simply refused to be positioned beneath it. What started as a single voice in Geneva soon echoed across oceans, cutting through hemispheres like a lightning bolt in clear sky. Latin America, long familiar with the bitter taste of imposed development, recognized the resonance instantly. In La Paz, Bolivia, President Maria Alvarez stood before her Congress and held up a printed transcript of Ibrahim Traoré's speech. "He spoke for more than Africa," she said. "He spoke for every nation ever told to bow before the benefactor's hand." By week's end, Bolivia, Ecuador, and Honduras issued a joint declaration calling for a new sovereign partnership model in all international negotiations. The phrase had been lifted directly from the Geneva speech. Across Asia, similar movements stirred. In Bangladesh, student activists cited the Geneva Doctrine during university protests, demanding their government reject new development loans that came tethered to agricultural policy reforms. In Sri Lanka, a prominent think tank hosted a conference titled "After Aid, Lessons from Geneva," with panels dissecting how nations could break cycles of financial dependency without collapsing under global pressure. Even in the Philippines, where Western alliances ran deep, a new block of lawmakers pushed for legislation that banned foreign assistance deals containing embedded procurement clauses. But it wasn't just policy shifting, it was the global intellectual conversation. Within 3 months of the Geneva summit, The speech had been cited in policy reviews by the United Nations Economic and Social Council, and an ethics course at Harvard's Kennedy School renamed its capstone module, Dignity and Diplomacy, the Geneva Moment. At the African Union's annual summit, leaders voted to include Geneva principles in all future intracontinental cooperation, making it the most rapidly adopted set of norms since the AU Charter itself. One by one, the pillars of conditional aid began to crack. A joint infrastructure deal between South Africa and Indonesia pointedly excluded any external lenders, financed entirely through bilateral bonds and regional capital pools. In their press release, the two nations stated, "We are not refusing help. We are redefining help." Their power plant project became a media symbol. Two nations once on the receiving end of decades of technical support, now designing, funding, and building on their own terms. Meanwhile, international law scholars began proposing updated definitions of development partnership. No longer would aid be synonymous with leverage. Instead, the emerging framework stressed reciprocity, cultural sovereignty, and long-term capacity building. Several African and Latin American states jointly submitted a draft resolution to the UN proposing a Global South Charter on Equitable Cooperation, citing Geneva as its philosophical root. The charter would prohibit any foreign agreement that demanded changes to a recipient country's language policy, educational system, or resource ownership laws. The world wasn't turning away from development. It was turning toward dignified development. And Geneva was no longer just a place on the map. It had become a metaphor, a watershed, a case study in truth told at scale. Where one young president once stood alone, now entire regions were standing together. The Global South wasn't just uniting, it was redefining the terms of engagement for the 21st century. The hall was silent, not with anticipation, but with the kind of reverence reserved for moments already understood as historic before they even began. The United Nations General Assembly, a room accustomed to posturing and platitudes, seemed smaller that day, quieter. Heads of state, ambassadors, secretaries, and observers leaned forward ever so slightly as Ibrahim Traoré took the podium. There were no flags waving, no fire in his voice, just a steady presence, eyes calm, tone controlled, and words chosen with the precision of a surgeon. "I did not come here to criticize," he began, pausing long enough for his meaning to sink in. "I came here to clarify." He spoke not of aid statistics or GDP growth, but of principle. Dignity, he said, is not an African issue. It is a human one. A murmur swept through the chamber, not disagreement, but recognition. There is a kind of help, he continued, that builds hospitals, and another that tells you how to run them. There is a kind of aid that feeds the hungry, and another that decides what they should eat, who should cook, and how much salt is allowed in the recipe. We know the difference now, and we will not forget it. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It carried with it the power of someone who had no desire to perform, only to tell the truth plainly. "We do not reject cooperation," he said. "We reject control dressed as generosity. We are not refusing assistance. We are refusing the assumption that assistance must be purchased with silence." He looked around the room, not defiantly, but openly, like someone inviting every delegate to a higher standard. "I am here because our children deserve better than gratitude for things they never asked for. They deserve fairness. They deserve partnership, and so do yours." A quiet applause began, not the usual performative clapping of protocol, but the slow rise of something deeper. Traoré stepped back from the microphone. No dramatic exit, no final plea. He had said what he came to say, and the world for once seemed ready to listen, not just to a president, but to an idea whose time had come. In a dusty courtyard outside Ouagadougou, a 10-year-old named Khalifa borrows his uncle's phone and taps the shaky clip titled, "I Return Both." He has never been inside an air-conditioned hall or seen a chandelier, yet he understands the hush that follows Traoré's sentences. When the video ends, Khalifa runs to his mother, eyes bright. "I want to speak like that one day," he says, breathless. His mother, who sells vegetables at dawn, rests a calloused hand on his shoulder. She doesn't mention politics or geopolitics. She simply nods and tells him to keep listening to words that make people quiet. In that moment, the speech stops being a headline. It becomes a seed, planted in a heart that may one day carry its own harvest of truth. Far from the viral frenzy, Ibrahim Traoré walks the cracked paths of a rural clinic, greeting nurses by name. Reporters beg for exclusive profiles, fashion magazines request photo spreads, but he declines with a half smile. "I didn't speak to shame," he tells a visiting teacher from Mali. "I spoke to awaken." The teacher realizes that Traoré's greatest defense against fame is humility. He still wears the same green uniform, still carries the same dog-eared notebook. The world calls him a symbol, he calls himself a relay. Every handshake, every whispered thanks reminds him the speech now belongs to millions who had no microphone. His journey, from quiet soldier to continental lodestar, proves power can travel the world, yet remain anchored in restless conscience. Embassies rewrite memoranda. Lenders adjust interest clauses, and classrooms from Manila to Bogota debate the Geneva Principles. Some governments resist, others adapt, but all must answer new questions about dignity and dependency. In village councils and cabinet rooms alike, people repeat the three sentences that broke the marble calm. The story hasn't ended. It has pivoted, forcing systems to bend toward mutual respect or break under the weight of their own assumptions. And so we arrive at a crossroads lit by one quiet voice. When the powerful speak with noise and the humble speak with truth, whose words will you remember? True dignity cannot be bought, borrowed, or imposed. It must be honored. This story reminds us that power without respect breeds resentment, while humility spoken with truth can shift entire systems. Whether in relationships, work, or global affairs, real influence begins with listening and empowering, not controlling. Let Traoré's courage inspire us to speak up when silence feels safer and to choose fairness over comfort. Question for you. In your own life, where have you mistaken control for leadership? And how might you lead differently starting today? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Captain of Truth, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Captain of Truth.